Welcome to the Play Podcast with me, Douglas Schatz. Hello, and welcome to episode 32 of the Play Podcast, where we explore the greatest new and classic plays. I'm Douglas Schatz, founder and host of the Play Podcast. The curtain does not rise today on the set of a single play, but on brief glimpses of a number of scenes from different plays, for we've come around again to that time when I like to assemble a collection of footnotes on the plays that we've featured in recent episodes. My footnotes consist of bits of research that did not make it into the podcast, as well as further personal observations on the plays that have been prompted by my conversation with my guest. I published these notes on the Play Podcast website at some point following the broadcast of the episode, so my apologies to assiduous followers who may well already have read some of this content. I hope for some others, this may be an enjoyable way to absorb some further incidental information about a play that you may know, or may inspire you to listen to an episode that you haven't yet sampled. I'll also confess that recording these footnotes episodes is a way to help cover breaks in the schedule, where I'm fitting in a holiday, for example, as I am next week. I'm delighted to have been able to return to going to live theatre in recent weeks, and I've seen some wonderful shows. I've many more booked over the coming weeks, and I hope that we'll be talking about some of these in forthcoming episodes. Although the podcast is intended to be an enduring exploration of a play, rather than a review of an individual production, as the theatres are reopening, it may offer listeners a chance to see our selected play in a current production. It certainly offers us more opportunities to talk with guests who are immersed in the play at the time. So, to Footnotes Volume 3. Nina Raine's play Consent premiered at the National Theatre, followed by a run in the West End in 2017. When I spoke with the playwright herself in April this year, we were absorbed and appalled by coverage in the UK media of the rape and murder of Sarah Everard by an off-duty policeman. Consent's examination of the origins and consequences of male aggression towards women could not have been more relevant. And of course, the failings of our justice system to account proportionally or sensitively with cases of sexual violence continue. Despite the fact that the number of rape cases reported in the UK has risen sharply over the past 5 years, only 1.4% of these reported cases result in a conviction. There are many reasons for this, of course, but one scene in the play illuminated some of the problem. The main characters in the play are barristers, and in this disturbing scene we witness one of them, the prosecuting barrister, cross-examine the rape victim in a trial. His intent in this exchange is to put her behavior and character on trial. He focuses in a narrative of the event on how much she had to drink, why she allowed her attacker to stay overnight, and additionally refers to the fact that she's previously had cause to visit a psychotherapist. The approach is all designed to discredit the victim and divert attention from the actions or guilt of the attacker. It is unsettling to watch, as much because, for the interrogator, it is clearly a calculated, cold-hearted performance, in stark contrast to the victim's genuine emotional distress. Of course, we know that the courtroom has its own ritualistic processes, but Nina Raine reminds us how powerful and perverse these can be in this scene. She underlines the ruthlessness and theatricality of the barrister's technique when we see two of the barristers, Edward and Tim, describing some of their rhetorical tricks of the trade. Their interview tactics include careful employment of open and closed questions to establish the point that they wish to make, or boxing a witness in with irreconcilable choices. The fact that the men are sharing these inside tips with Zara, an actress who is auditioning for the role of a barrister in a TV drama, reinforces the idea of the courtroom as artificial theater, and the principals as performers, often, sadly it must be said, at the expense of the truth. There are other theatrical references in Consent, which are amusing to recognize, but which also remind us that there is nothing new when it comes to combustible relationships between men and women. The play cleverly mirrors the professional world of the barristers and their cases of sexual violence with their own personal marital and extramarital relationships, signaling in their behavior that the line between assumed sexual consent and crime can be a very thin one. The parallels between the professional and personal are further suggested by the references they make to Greek tragedy. The actress Zara is rehearsing a Greek tragedy, and although the world of the 21st century metropolitan couples is centuries away from ancient Greece, their flippant references to features of Greek drama set off some satisfying resonances with the drama we witness. As in Greek tragedy, the women are victims of often brutal treatment by their men and find themselves on the moral high ground. The men are shits and the women are insufferable because they're so holier than thou, as Barrister Tim succinctly puts it. And Zara's warning, before you mistreat your women, remember what they're capable of, forecasts the vengeance that the two contemporary women in the play will go on to unleash on their spouses when they are wronged. Tim's definition of Greek tragedy as two opposing characters holding two relative but mutually destructive truths precisely encapsulates the conflict that arises over consent in what becomes a case of marital rape. Or put more simply, for adversaries in a courtroom contesting the interpretation of sexual consent, it's two people thinking they're right, with potentially tragic consequences. The ambiguities of consent are explored not just in the rape case in the courtroom, but in the personal relationships between the couples in the play. All of the characters find themselves in situations that threaten the stability of their lives because they stray into sexual infidelity without, it seems, realizing the potential consequences of their actions. They display a remarkable lack of understanding about their own behavior. There is a phrase that Michael Frayn used in our episode about his play Copenhagen, which I think could apply to the behavior of these characters: the epistemology of intent, which, as I understood it, describes the knowledge, or lack of it, that we have about why we choose certain courses of action or what motivates our decisions. As Kitty in Consent recognizes about herself and her friends, I'm astounded by the lack of insight, the way people don't even see what they're doing, even as they're doing it. She herself embarks casually on an affair with Tim and unexpectedly finds herself emotionally overwhelmed. She is almost bewildered by her own behavior, resigned to accepting, as she says, that you can't legislate for human behavior. Similarly, the actress, Zara's own judgment seems unreliable when on first meeting she declares unequivocally that she just doesn't fancy Tim, only to surprise us subsequently by falling for him. Underlining many of their irrational impulses is, of course, the mystery and power of sexual attraction. As Jake pointedly observes, it's impossible to communicate the pheromonal semiology of sexual attraction. Or as Rachel puts it more simply, is there anything that doesn't stem from a sexual motive? Their behavior certainly seems to indicate that its power overrides the rational management of their actions. Tim cannot account to Edward, for example, for the reason that he continues his affair with Kitty. When you boil an egg, the structure of the molecules change. The egg doesn't know why, it just becomes a boiled egg. Edward doesn't grant, however, that we are really that unaware of our own actions. He claims that we cannot escape the disapproving voice inside our head, our moral consciousness, although we are capable of creating our own justifications to suit the moment. Ultimately, Edward himself is proof of the limits of our consciousness to comprehend our own motives. Rachel challenges him on his anger and aggression towards his wife, Kitty. "Ed, this is crazy. You're rational. You're intelligent." To which Jake responds, "If you're hurt enough, you become stupid." Sexual violence may be an expression of rage or frustration at a lack of control, and aggression is an attempt to exert control. The characters in the play frequently demonstrate a lack of understanding of each other, but most tellingly also of themselves. When Jake says about his own bad behavior, "I look back at myself and I don't know who the person was who did those things," he could have been speaking for all of them. The references to Greek tragedy and the danger of a woman scorned in consent provide a neat link to our next play, Medea, where of course a wronged woman wreaks havoc in ancient Corinth. In fact, the horror of Medea's actions in killing her ex-husband's new wife and her own children was not just the revenge of a betrayed wife, but a salutary tale for Greek society. During our podcast about the play, my guest, classical scholar Edith Hall, described the society in ancient Greece as one where women lived very circumscribed lives, restricted largely to their domestic dwellings and duties. Any threat to the stability of marriage and its purpose of perpetuating the male line was especially feared. It is no wonder, therefore, that simply as a character, Medea's unrestrained energy and courage were distrusted, even feared. Her independence of mind and her intelligence mark her out as a serious threat, as she herself says, somewhat sardonically, to the women of Corinth in the chorus. "Women of Corinth, don't teach your daughters to think for themselves. They'll encounter nothing but suspicion and mistrust. No man in his right mind should teach children to be clever. No point in being cleverer than the next man. People don't like it." Creon, the king of Corinth, so distrusts Medea that he believes that she is a witch with dark and magical powers. In fact, as it turns out, he was not far wrong. Medea was in fact half mortal, half god, but Creon only sensed the threat she represented to the patriarchal status quo. Edith also pointed out that there was a general view, propounded by Aristotle no less, that women were less capable of ethical thought than men, and must therefore be controlled and contained. If ungoverned, they may disturb the ordered life of the city, he warned. Medea is also feared because she is not Greek. Her husband Jason describes her homeland as an uncivilized place, and when he discovers what she has done to their children, he rages that no Greek woman would have done it. So the play as a whole is therefore a cautionary tale for the men in the audience in ancient Athens. To beware immigrants. Xenophobia is a Greek word, after all, and even more, an unfettered woman. Aristotle may not have got it right about the ethical capacity of women, but his ideas on what define dramatic tragedy are more enduring. In his Poetics, he suggested that suffering was an essential ingredient of tragedy, and that as an audience we must feel both pity and fear. Pity for the sufferer and fear that it could happen to us. On both counts, Medea succeeds. We certainly feel Medea's anguish at her betrayal, and while we may remain confident that we would not kill our own children, we do recognize the misery and rage that can overcome our reason when we have been deeply hurt. As Edith has said about the play, it looks suffering and human misery directly in the face. It is unflinching. How are we able to watch such terrible agony? Aristotle would point to the act of catharsis, by which we purge our own emotions through vicarious engagement with the drama. While we are emotionally drawn into the suffering we are witnessing, we are simultaneously still conscious of the artifice of theater, which makes it just about bearable to watch a mother murder her own children on stage. In fact, as Edith pointed out, paradoxically, this may also make it harder to watch. We have no power to intervene to help the characters on stage who are suffering or in peril. This is the sweet torture of great tragedy. From Greek tragedy to Italian comedy next. In fact, to both Italian and British comedy, because our next episode appropriately covered two plays for the price of one. Carlo Goldoni's Commedia dell'arte classic A Servant to Two Masters from 1746, and Richard Bean's hilarious update One Man, Two Guvnors. One of the joys of looking at these plays together was identifying the traditional ingredients that define Commedia dell'arte, and then how Richard Bean translated these so successfully into his version set in 1960s Brighton. The cast list of Commedia dell'arte productions consisted of the same stock characters, whose costumes, characteristics, and part in the plot were consistent and readily recognizable by their audience. They were stereotypes that reflected the hierarchy of their local society. The main star was the zany, who is a clown or servant, often specifically the harlequin, easily identifiable by the check design of his costume. I loved the 1960s version in the suit that James Corden as Francis wore in One Man, Two Guvnors. The zany is the protagonist of the play, an everyman who we as the audience identify with and pull for, while also laughing at him. He is not the brightest of minds, is emotional rather than rational, and lives very much in the moment. He's also scheming and manipulative, so he gets himself into difficult positions of his own making. But he has a strong survival instinct and is faithful, and he is always hungry, more about which in due course. The harlequin plays a big part in breaking up or restoring relationships between the other characters, particularly, of course, the young lovers, or innamorati. The plot of the commedia play revolves around the obstacles that are put in the way of the lovers before they are finally united. The innamorati are in love with the idea of love, overdramatic in everything they do, but always sincere. They are conceited, but not wise or experienced enough in love or the world, so they must rely on the zany to help them fulfill their destiny. The main obstacles to their destiny are usually their parents' desire for another outcome. The future of the lovers is usually in the hands of the vecchi, or old men, Pantalone being the central character in the plot. He is usually the father to one of the lovers, often single or a widower. He's wealthy and greedy with a large ego. Pantalone is aligned with or against another of the vecchi, Il Dottore, who is a man of learning, a doctor or a lawyer, but who loves the sound of his own voice and is characterized by spouting ersatz Latin or Greek. No less important in the panoply of characters in the commedia are the servants. As the harlequin is the star of the show, he is often paired with a female servant known as Columbina, or Little Dove. She is often the harlequin's mistress, and her costume will complement the harlequin's. She is smart, down-to-earth in character, who can see situations for what they are. In fact, the women are often smarter than the men in the world of the commedia, despite, or perhaps because, of the fact that the 18th century society it reflects was, of course, a patriarchal one. Smeraldina, the sharp-tongued servant in A Servant to Two Masters, is certainly a spokeswoman for her sex, but so too is Beatrice, the young lover who disguises herself as a man to secure the dowry and rescue her lover. With the initiative and courage to pursue her plan, she's certainly a force to be reckoned with, and presents a suggestive symbol of the potential power of women in a man's world. It is telling, of course, that Beatrice achieves her success by dressing and behaving as a man. She apparently often dressed like a man to go riding when she was young, signaling an independence of strength and spirit. And when, at the end of the play, her lover Ferlindo expects her to revert to type when they are married and pop yourself into a blouse and bodice, she defies him, preferring to retain her manly attire. I think we can take this as a literal indication of who will be wearing the trousers in their relationship. The 18th century idea that the only way that women could succeed in a man's world was to behave like a man was echoed for our time in One Man, Two Guvnors, when the servant Dolly knowingly predicts in 1963, this is, that in 20 years' time there'll be a woman in 10 Downing Street, and she won't be doing the washing up. Then you'll see exactly what women can do. You'll see a more just and fair society. The feminine voice of compassion for the poor will be the guiding principle of government, and there'll be an end to foreign wars. Irony, of course. As it happened, Mrs. Thatcher's power was deemed by some to have been achieved by her mimicking macho postures rather than revolutionizing political values. And it could be argued that many still thought that Hillary Clinton's ambition betrayed her sex. Perhaps we still await a world where it is not necessary to dress and behave like the cock of the midden to progress, to quote the wise servant Smeraldina again. I mentioned earlier that one of the characteristics of the Harlequin character was that he was always hungry. Truffaldino in A Servant to Two Masters and Francis in One Man, Two Guvnors both are, and their hunger drives their actions. As a proper footnote here, I discovered that the origin of the Harlequin's hunger is specific to the time and place that Commedia was first created. The Harlequin was usually attributed with being a peasant from the particular province of Bergamo, as Truffaldino is in A Servant to Two Masters. During the 15th century, the people of Bergamo were facing a famine due to cheaper imports from Greece after their region was conquered by the Venetian army. They flooded into the cities such as Venice, offering themselves for whatever work they could find and eking out a living in any way they could. The Commedia audience would certainly have recognized themselves in the character of the hungry servant in search of work and food. Poverty was not something the characters of our next play knew much about. Noel Coward's present laughter is rather about the perils of fame and fortune and of the excesses that go with it, including self-indulgence. The lead character, Gary Essendine, is a star of the London stage with an ego and celebrity lifestyle to match. Essendine is, of course, a thinly disguised alter ego of Noel Coward himself, who first performed the role when the play premiered in 1942. Within Coward's portrait of the flamboyant actor, there are hints that there is more to him than the showman that he's playing most of the time. Certainly his succession of wannabe lovers would like to think that they will bring out his true character, hidden beneath the showy exterior. A man who will be honest and sensitive, and most of all, faithfully loving to them. As one of them, Joanna, puts it, "I want you to be what I believe you really are, friendly and genuine, someone to be trusted. I want you to do me the honor of stopping your eternal performance for a little, ring down the curtain, take off your makeup, and relax." Of course, it is his wife Liz who knows him best. "He's not nearly as flamboyant as he pretends to be," she says. She and we know that Gary is always much more in control than he lets on, aware of the stakes he is playing with and what is required to sustain both his pleasures and his position. We are given a glimpse of his potential vulnerability when, ironically, having complained about his lack of peace from the demands of all around him, he's unhappy when he finds himself alone on the eve of his departure to Africa. And he is certainly dependent on Liz for practical and emotional support. Coward is playing with this by conjuring Gary's surname, Essendine, as an anagram of neediness. Gary himself proclaims that he has a clear-eyed view of himself and his behavior. "I always have believed that there's far too much damn nonsense talked about sex. To me, the whole business is overrated and always has been. I enjoy it for what it's worth, and what is more, I fully intend to go on doing so for as long as anybody's interested. And when the time comes that they're not, I shall be perfectly content to settle down with an apple and a good book." His great speech perfectly captures the contradictions of his character. It's overly dramatic, it contains some truth, and it is diluted. It's virtually impossible to imagine Gary settling for the apple and a good book. Gary's speech is part of an ongoing debate through the play as to the morality of casual sexual relationships, what Liz neatly labels in Gary's case casual scampering, a lovely phrase. Gary is determined that his persistent philandering does not do any harm to anybody, but Liz is less sure. You do harm to yourself and to the few, the very few who really mind about you. That said, judging by the behavior of most of the characters, they are far from being seriously morally discomfited by their carryings on. For Liz, Gary's buccaneering is rather undignified, and most injudicious only when it really threatens to unsettle the professional team that keeps the whole Gary Essendine show on the road. Both of Gary's seductresses, Daphne and Joanna, are happy to settle for what Joanna calls the fun of love, without the pangs of love or strings attached. She calls it an adult point of view, one which Daphne is also content to go along with. "I don't want to marry you or anything like that. I'll just be there when you want me, when you're tired and lonely and want someone to put their arms around you." Gary professes to be outraged by all these immoral attitudes, a stance which is clearly pretentious and hypocritical, as confirmed by his big speech we've just quoted, reaffirming his determination to continue to pursue his pleasures, for as long as anybody's interested. It is hard not to hear Coward's own voice behind Gary's final proclamation on the matter. "I'm an artiste, am I not? Surely I may be allowed a little license." Conor McPherson's Girl from the North Country, the subject of our next episode, is an extraordinary collaboration between the playwright and musician and songwriter Bob Dylan. The resulting play with music is a distinctive and rich form, combining all of the effects and power of live drama, dialogue, character, story, staging, with the lyrics and melodies of the music. I was particularly interested in asking Conor how he came to select and meld the Dylan songs that he chose with the play. His answers suggested that his choices were largely led by instinct. I myself couldn't resist trying to read connections between the songs and specific characters or themes of the play. Some of the songs seem to have a direct connection. The story of the black boxer Reuben Carter in Hurricane has its obvious parallel with the character of Joe Scott, for example, who is also on the run from the law. Mostly, however, the songs suggest a feeling or meaning that could apply to any of the characters, their hopes for love or honor, or they may reflect the mood and challenges of the times they live in. The lament, "How does it feel to be without a home, having to scrounge for your next meal," for example, from Like a Rolling Stone, speaks for any of the itinerant characters drifting from one place to another. The plaintive gospel of Slow Train suggests that change in America is coming, albeit too slowly, especially in the South where racial laws are still outdated. And of course, many of the songs intone the ache of love lost or misplaced, which so many of the characters feel. It was a huge privilege to talk with Conor about his magical creation. As he said, the theater can be a spiritual place, like a church, and the music in the play certainly magnifies the drama in the way that music in a church can. With Conor's assistance, I was all the more grateful to be able to feature a few excerpts from the music in the podcast. The character of Elizabeth in Girl from the North Country suffers from early onset dementia. It is the nature of the disease that her powers of perception vary, and it is difficult to know how clear her mind is or what she may say at any given time. Another feature of the disease is that it seems to reduce one's inhibitions to say whatever one is thinking, regardless of social niceties. Elizabeth is unrestrained in describing what she sees, and in fact, in so doing, she has the capacity to pinpoint the truths that others are leaving unsaid. She senses, for example, that the traveling Bible salesman, Reverend Marlowe, is a louse, as she calls him, and she challenges old man Perry, who is pursuing the young Marianne, to find someone your own age, you old goat. Because she sits relatively silently at the side of the action most of the time, we underestimate her powers of observation and understanding, so are surprised when she calls out her husband Nick on his adulterous relationship with Mrs. Nielsen, referring to "your little lady woman up in your attic." And more poignantly, in the end, she recognizes the real truth of her bond with her husband Nick, when she intervenes to stop him from ending his own life, and vows to stay with him despite not loving him the way he wants. Elizabeth is much more than just the mad woman in the corner. She's a truth-teller. We talked in the podcast about how Conor's play has some of the elements of Chekhov's drama. It certainly has a Chekhovian setting, with an ensemble of characters revolving around the boarding house, as they do in those great Russian estates, each with their own stories of hope, heartbreak, tragedy, and stoic suffering. Like Chekhov, despite the characters' obvious failings and flaws, most are granted some dignity in their suffering. It may not always excuse their behavior or character, but at least we understand its source and recognize some of our own weaknesses. One of Chekhov's great strengths is the depth of focus he gives to even the minor characters, as Conor does here. Each of them is given a story that reveals the heart of their emotional identity. The son Jean, for example, who can't bring himself to declare the truth of his love and need for Kate, or his disappointment for failing to make more of himself. The Burkes, who know but cannot admit the reality of their financial and emotional desolation. And even Mr. Perry, for example, who we mostly feel a sort of disgust for because of his inappropriate pursuit of Marianne. But there is a moment when he speaks of how hard it is to grow old alone, with only the memories of the warmth of being with someone else. We feel some degree of empathy for his desires and sadness. I think Conor may have said that all modern playwrights follow in the footsteps of Chekhov, and I mean it as a compliment to him that his play does so. Sheila Delaney's play, A Taste of Honey, caused a sensation when it premiered in 1958 at the Theatre Royal in Stratford, East London, because of its frank portrayal of a working-class single mother and daughter living on the margins of society. Delaney was determined to write about the real people she saw around her who were struggling to cope with the hardships of life in Salford in the 1950s. She said, "I see the theatre as a place where you should go not only to be entertained, but where the audience has contact with real people, people who are alive. The real people we meet in A Taste of Honey are living in impoverished circumstances, are poorly educated, feckless and flawed, but they're also funny, determined, and independent." She wanted to show the realities of the depredation in the world she knew, but also people's resilience. As Helen warns her daughter, Jo, there's 2 W's in your future, work or want. And for a time, we see Jo actually holding down 2 jobs. Tellingly, it is not difficult to relate to this historic social portrait when we look at the current disparity in wealth and opportunity between regions of the UK that is in need of levelling up today. The fact that Delaney's cast featured a single mother, a mixed-race couple, a homosexual student, and a black maternity nurse was certainly radical for its time, but is not just hindsight that affirms that she was not only presenting the real world of her time, but a vision of the emerging plurality of our own society. One of the themes of the play, played out in the fractious relationship between mother and daughter, is that it is difficult to escape repeating the patterns of behavior that we absorb from our parents. It's a point that Helen even recognizes herself, despite her general negligence as Jo's mother. Ironically, when Jo announces that she's engaged to be married at a young age, Helen chastises her for not learning from her own mistakes. We also talked in the podcast about how Jo replicates Helen's behavior in seeking self-worth by seducing a man and getting recklessly pregnant. To underline the potential cycle of repetition, there are echoes of Helen's first marriage in Jo's friendship with her homosexual friend Jeff. We learn that Helen's first husband was incapable of satisfying her sexual needs, as Jeff is for Jo, of course, because he is gay. And in a reverse image of Helen's husband, who left her because he refused to care for another man's child, Jeff declares himself willing to stay to look after Jo's child. The theme is further underlined by a literary reference to Ibsen's play Ghosts, which is cited when Jo expresses her concern that she may have inherited her father's mental weaknesses. The parallel being that in Ghosts, Oswald inherits syphilis from his father. In fact, the play shows us that it is the sins of her mother, rather than her father, that have the most impact on Jo and her life. By way of a footnote to our episode on Caryl Churchill's stunning play Escaped Alone, I thought that I would share some background on my experience of filming the play during lockdown. I'm privileged to be a member of the play selection committee at my local amateur theatre club, and during the past 18 months, as you can imagine, it has been very difficult to plan future productions in our theatre. We decided that one way that we could continue to make theatre happen in some form would be to stage a play in the theatre without an audience, and film the result for presentation online. We knew that with various lockdown restrictions in place, we would have to choose a play that we could mount while complying with the legal criteria in place. This meant choosing a title with a small cast. We might be limited to having no more than 6 people together during rehearsal, for example, and also one that required a relatively simple set and minimized the physical interaction within the cast. So we selected Escaped Alone, firstly because with its cast of 4 sitting fixed in their garden chairs throughout, it could be practically staged, maintaining social distancing. There were a number of other equally compelling reasons that we wanted to do Escaped Alone. The play offered 4 wonderful roles for older women, a fact that may well be unique on the stage. It also displays all of the challenging power as well as the humor characteristic of Caryl Churchill's wonderful language. And finally, because of the extraordinary prescience of its vision of a world overcome by collective disaster. The play speaks to our fears about the future of the planet, as well as our personal anxieties, for example, when isolated by age or the pandemic, while also offering some salvation in the strength of our community, as friends, as neighbors, or as open-minded theatergoers. When it came to staging the play, our director had the vision to realize that we had an opportunity to film the play not just as a record of a single theatrical performance, but as a film in its own right. This meant that we could shoot the production in multiple takes and with different camera angles and perspective, rather than as a single run-through. We hoped that this would provide additional detail and texture to the dynamics between the characters, as well as an enhanced focus on the intense personal monologues that each of the women deliver. It also offered an opportunity to suggest a particular interpretation of Mrs. Jarrett's role as the messenger or narrator in the form of the play. After weeks of rehearsal with the text via Zoom, in our gardens, and finally in the empty theater, we were ready to film. We spent a day constructing the set and setting up the lighting, sound, and camera infrastructure, followed by 4 long, intense days of filming to complete the 125-page shot list. The cast were phenomenally patient and professional, delivering funny, deeply moving performances, often many times over. It was an enormously rewarding, collaborative experience, which felt like an appropriately resilient and communal response to the challenge of the pandemic, one that we hope is also true to the spirit of Caryl Churchill's prophetic play. So, a plug. Teddington Theatre Club's film of Escaped Alone will be broadcast online for 5 nights from the 2nd to the 6th of September 2021. You can find a link to more information and to book tickets on the Escaped Alone pages of the Play Podcast website, or search Teddington Theatre Club. My guest in the podcast about Escaped Alone, Professor Elaine Aston, joked during our conversation that if Caryl Churchill writes about something happening in the future in a play, that event will come to pass. It is impossible not to be struck by Churchill's prescience in the pictures she paints in Mrs. Jarrett's monologues of a world overcome by environmental disasters, as well as by the violence and anarchy that may ensue when mankind fights over scarce resource or law and order has broken down under the pressure of extreme events. Although the language or images she uses may seem too surreal to be true at times, the detail is so close to what we know that it feels that it could happen, or already has. It reminded me of the extraordinary reality of another prophetic writer, Margaret Atwood, who famously said about her novel The Handmaid's Tale that it contained nothing that hadn't already happened somewhere in the world. As Elaine also suggested, Mrs. Jarrett is like the messenger in Greek drama, who brings truth the characters do not want to hear. As another footnote, I was reminded of the soothsayer Tiresias from Oedipus Rex and Antigone, for example, who despite his physical blindness is able to see and relate unpalatable truths. Caryl Churchill is a soothsayer of sorts, I think. Samuel Beckett was also a prophetic artist. I was fortunate enough recently to see a production of his third great masterpiece, Happy Days, at the Riverside Studios in London. I was doubly fortunate to be able to talk in our latest episode with Lisa Dwan, who gave a stunning performance as Winnie in that production. Although it was written exactly 60 years ago, the central image of Winnie, buried in a mound of scorched earth, surrounded by an empty landscape, speaks in some way to our own time, when many have endured enforced confinement in a world struck by collective disaster. When I asked Lisa about the striking visual tableau that we see on stage in Happy Days, she described Samuel Beckett as an installation artist. Certainly, the visual settings of his plays are extraordinarily arresting. They are simple, yet mysterious and powerful. The lone tree in the otherwise empty place where Vladimir and Estragon wait for Godot, for example. Or the room with the windows set high up in the wall, the 2 dustbins, and a single throne-like chair in Endgame. We are aware that these particular locations are part of a larger world, but the characters that we see do not have any agency to change or exit their self-contained space. Their constrained circumstances prompt many questions. What is in the world beyond? How have they arrived in this situation? How do they practically survive without the usual necessities? In fact, what I think is notable is how quickly we put aside such practical questions and accept the status quo of the world we are witnessing. We understand very quickly that the space that the characters occupy is a metaphoric one. As Lisa observed, Beckett's landscapes reflect a psychological state. We experience directly the state of existential uncertainty and inquiry the characters do, and we also understand that there are no rational explanations for what we are seeing. We accept that any answers are going to be unknowable, and we simply adapt to the circumstances we are presented with, as the characters do. In stripping back the physical world to a minimum, Beckett also imbues it with a sense of existential challenge, so that what we witness and experience is essentially consciousness itself. How we respond to psychological pressure, doubt, or fear. As Lisa so succinctly put it, Beckett was putting the mind on stage. Throughout Happy Days, Winnie refers obliquely to how life was in a time before as being in the old style. Although she never explains explicitly what occurred to separate her from the past, we understand her reference to be describing a world and a life that we would recognize as normal. She describes her first dance, her wedding day, and even an encounter with a man in a tool shed. Winnie suggests that time passed differently in the old style, where the definition of a day was not signaled by the ringing of a bell. Not a day goes by, to speak in the old style, she says. Linear time as we know it, and it used to be for Winnie, no longer seems to apply. There does not appear to be any sunset. The weather never changes. Nothing grows. And in fact, Winnie suggests that things that she removes from her bag will reappear again tomorrow. Time is an artificial construct of the old world, and a way of thinking. May one still speak of time? Say it is a long time now, Willie, since I saw you, since I heard you. May one? One does. Smiles. The old style. Yet we do have a sense that Winnie's time is running out. The earth has risen to engulf her up to her neck. Ah, well, not long now, Winnie. Can't be long now, until the bell for sleep. And of course, the title of the play refers to transient, subjective, and limited time. In the end, Winnie exclaims, "Oh, this is a happy day. This will have been another happy day. After all, so far." Ambiguous, inevitably. And that is it for our happy day. Thanks for listening to this smorgasbord of footnotes. See you next time when I'll be joined by a welcome expert guest and we'll talk about another great play.
Thanks for listening. To listen to other episodes, to find out news about future episodes, or to leave comments about what you've heard, please visit us at www.theplaypodcast.com. You can also follow us on Facebook or on Twitter at theplaypod. You're also welcome to email plays@theplaypodcast.com to suggest plays that we could talk about in future episodes. You can also register your suggestion on the website. Thanks again, and see you next time.